Welcome, 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 everybody. It's Thursday morning, and can you believe it's May already? It's Peter Duncan from MicroSeismic Inc. in what is the fifth, welcoming you to the fifth in our virtual forums. And I tell you, we had a dry run starting at 8 o'clock this morning. I think it started at 6 o'clock this morning, and everything was working fine. And we're not sure that it's working now, but we're hoping that you can hear me. Can I get a thumbs up that they can hear me? Okay, I'm good, so apparently.
Awesome.
So as I said, it's May already, and this is the fifth. You may remember that our annual users forum had to be canceled because we had a snowstorm, if you can imagine, here in Houston. And those of you who are attending here from Calgary, you'll think, ha ha. But you're right, it wasn't a real snowstorm, but it was enough to shut down Houston. We had some great speakers lined up who had prepared speeches, and we have asked them to go forward. No, please, not yet. Ask them to go forward, and that's how this series of blogs has originated, and we're going to continue it because we've had great attendance. Now, today, I'm welcoming you to our virtual talk on the carbon capture business, carbon capture and evolving market. And we've got a world-class expert, Greg Matlock from EY, who's going to talk. But first, I wanted to highlight some of the upcoming talks that we're going to have. We have Zach Liu from Harvestone Carbon. I've heard Zach give this paper a couple of times. He's going to talk about Blue Flint, the project they're working on, and I know you'll enjoy that if you're interested in the carbon capture business. Then our own John McKenna is going to talk about advanced microseismic techniques, how to do refracts and things like that. And then we're going to have a whole panel on CCUS, geothermal come October, and then Andre Cook is coming down to talk about some of the really neat stuff she's doing with innovative acquisition of seismic, directed at 3D and 4D for CCUS and geothermal and the like. So we've got a program for the rest of the year that I know you're going to find interesting. You can register for any or all of our talks by just clicking on this QR code. I'm going to leave it here for a second. This QR code will take you directly to the registration page, and I'm going to show it again at the end if you haven't had a chance to get your cameras out. I will add here that during the talk, we are going to collect questions for Greg, and you can click on the Q&A button at the top of your screen and type questions in, and at the end of the talk, I'll be reading those questions to Greg and we'll participate. So let's get on with today's show. It's Greg Matlock. I'm going to read his biography because it is probably one I couldn't memorize. Greg currently serves as used to be Ernst & Young's America's Oil, Gas, and Chemicals Industry Tax Leader, as well as the America's Mining and Metals Industry Tax Leader. He is a partner, principal at EY's National Tax Department based in Houston. Greg has a significant experience in U.S. federal income tax planning. When we talk afterwards, Greg, planning and matters throughout the energy value chain, including mining and metals, oil and gas, power, utilities, and renewable energy, including the emerging or submerging energy transition asset classes, with particular emphasis on natural resource transactions. He has material structuring, planning, and economic feasibility experience for energy transactions and investments throughout the Americas. He mentioned that he was busy. Well, with all that going on, he is busy. And he, as a fun fact, he said that he's been to all 50 states. I think that's what he said. He might have said that all his exes live in Texas or all his exes live in all 50 states. I'm not quite sure. But with all that on his plate, he probably spends all of his time traveling around the country, and what must carry his wife with him, because he says his wife's been to all 50 states and his kids have been to almost all of the 50 states. And I'll tell you, we had a hard time tracking Greg down for today because he's traveling all the time. Now, Greg's going to talk to us about the current perspectives on the carbon capture market. And I don't know, from my perspective, it's a market that we've been expecting to bloom and just bust free over the last couple of years. And instead, it's been kind of caught high center and kind of dragging. And I know that Greg is going to tell us what's going on in the carbon market, what is going to happen in the future, perhaps what the current administration is going to mean, and their attitudes are going to mean for the CCUS business. I know there's a lot of you out there who are interested to hear what he is going to say. So with that, Greg, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you take it away.
Thanks, Peter. I appreciate it. And I wish I felt a little more highly of myself if I had X's in all 50 states, but I certainly don't. But I don't think that. Hey, this is it's unique timing for a discussion like this, and honestly, looking at the balance of your slate, things around geothermal. This current administration, we're going to get into this here in a couple of minutes, but Peter, you asked, hey, maybe some of the current administration may change some things, right? And unless any of you woke up thinking that you wanted to be abreast of all the emerging tax law developments, the House did pass a version of the House bill that we're going to talk about in a minute, but it's going to have material impacts, or could have material impacts on the economics of projects. So what we thought we'd get to today, in the next maybe half hour, 35 minutes or something like that, is do a really quick baseline set on carbon capture, and we're going to keep that light, but it's important to talk about that just because some of the things that are changing, or what drives these projects from an economic perspective, is so rooted, at least here in the United States, on the tax credit side. We're talking about what's happening in the market, and I may even start there. We're going to talk about the tax bill that's making its way through the legislative process, and then talk about some of the economic rights and entitlements, because carbon capture projects as a whole, and we're going to talk about those in different kind of silos, are incredibly integrated, and which is good and bad. Good because there are a lot of different levers one can pull. Bad because it requires a lot of coordination amongst the parties. Now, do you see the slide big says, what is carbon capture?
That's where you are. You're right on track. Take it away.
Wonderful. All right. So I put this in here just to level set. And again, Peter, when you and I were talking, I guess months ago at this point, we said, hey, let's not spend a whole lot of time on the basics. Let's get into the meat. But I think the basics, just at a very high level, are important to dictate some of the meat. So carbon capture, just as a whole, at least in the U.S., we're going to have a U.S. focus. Is a two-part animal, right? So you have to capture CO or CO2, so carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide. That's part one. And then part two, you got to do something good with it. And doing something good with it, there's obviously more formal and technical language there, but doing something good with it is one of three things. You dispose of it in secure geologic storage, right? The downhole permanent storage, sequestration. Second, you could use it in enhanced oil or natural gas recovery and then permanently store it. That's option two. Or option three is use it in an approved commercial manner. Now, when we focus on the front part, hey, I got to capture CO or CO2. You can certainly do that through the ambient air, right? You just collect the CO2 molecules through direct air capture systems and solvents. And then if you flip over to them, well, what about all these industrial manufacturing facilities, the things you see in that little yellow rectangle there, right? Coal-fired power plants, coal to liquids, waste production, cement plants, steel plants, natural gas processing. You're capturing the molecule directly at the source. But either way, you got to capture the molecule, and then you got to do something good with it. I start here, and this is just kind of a placeholder because I want to talk about what's happening kind of in the global market. So carbon capture, as we know, is not a new phenomenon. The technology largely isn't new, at least on the direct air capture side. I think there's folks trying to make advancements. Obviously, as you all know, in the downhole side, same thing. But the base technology of separating out molecules has been around for decades and decades. In fact, the entirety of a natural gas processing plant is the separation out of saleable hydrocarbons from non-saleable molecules. Carbon capture has been tried at length in the UK and elsewhere in the world. But if you look at the number of projects that are moving forward and or announced, the US dwarfs the rest of the country, right? It's almost not even close. So as of now, and I was just looking at some recent stats, see if I could get something even more because this changes daily. But the latest count I got was about over 300 active projects in the United States. at various levels. So people hear that and they say, whoa, 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 does that mean there's 300 projects that are putting molecules downhole? Absolutely not, right? But there's 300 projects, more than 300 projects at various stages of the evaluation phase. Now, when we look at that evaluation phase, and I referenced that kind of at the beginning, is carbon capture projects, unlike almost anything else, is just, well, every project when you're involving someone else's money is complicated. Any project where you're getting third-party capital is highly integrated, and there's a lot of different parties you got to kind of get on board and get to the table. But because of this two-part project, we're going to get to why that's the case. It's largely because of a tax credit. But because of that two-part project, you have to have everybody in the value chain agree. So, and the other thing that's to note, and I think many folks on this call would fully understand, different parts of the value chain have different uses, right? There's different skill sets, there's different core competencies among these groups. And so you run into, and I have a slide towards the end we'll get to, but it goes through who are the stakeholders, right? And you have emitters, you have capture companies, you have transport companies, you have downhole providers, you have MRV providers, monitoring, reporting, and verification, you have space owners, you have tax equity, you have service providers, you have all these different folks. And the reason why that's important is everybody's got to have to play together nicely, because if you take one of the scenarios, and this is going to drive to the economics, this will actually drive to the heart of the economics. If I take a scenario where let's say Peter owns a natural gas processing plant. And I go to Peter and I say, well, you're venting your CO2 into the air. I'm not sure you get any market credit for selling a low carbon molecule of natural gas or oil, but I could take that CO2, prevent it from being vented into the atmosphere, dehydrate it, compress it, move it, and put it down whole. And maybe I get a tax credit for that, right? We're going to talk about what that is here in a second. But in that situation, what's my saleable product? Right? I don't have any. I've taken a molecule that would otherwise be vented into the atmosphere. I've taken it, I've dehydrated, I've compressed it, I've moved it, and I've put it down whole, permanent. So I have no saleable product. So the revenue associated with that entire project, working with your emitter, making sure the cost of capture makes sense, working with a transport company, and what they're going to charge on either a capacity fee or a movement fee or something, a per metric ton downhole cost to your downhole provider, a fee for monitoring and reporting, maybe a royalty to your port owner. All these costs associated have to fit within a confined rubric. And the top of that is kind of whatever revenue you get from a tax and economic incentive perspective. And so what that means and why that's, Peter said, hey, we expected, and I agree with him, we expect that this was going to be some burgeoning and blooming environment, and it kind of looks like it's either paused or gotten a little, the acceleration has not matched expectations. And there's a couple of reasons, and we're going to get into both those today. One's just going to be just pure permitting. Permitting takes time. We'll talk about that. And then the second is just making sure that folks have a good understanding of economics. In this screen, you see a bunch of waste incineration, fertilizer, ethanol. The one thing to note is not all, and I would assume most folks know this, not all carbon capture projects are made the same. These projects largely come down to cost, right? The revenue line item, the top side of the project, we can estimate with reasonable certainty. These come down to costs. Because if I'm getting $85 a metric ton as a tax credit, and I'm going to have to discount that slightly, which we'll talk about, my margin on whether the project works comes down to my cost, and it's the cost of the value chain. So one of the things that has just made these projects just take time is how integrated they are generally, and then the agreements amongst the parties. Add on top of that most of these projects involve third-party financing. And if I'm lending to a project, what am I lending against? Right, go back to that example where I attach equipment to Peter's natural gas processing plant. If I go and try to get bank financing for that, sure, there's some inherent value in the capture equipment that I'm installing on his plant. Same for the compressors and dehydration units and some of the short pipeline to get to an offtake. But they're really lending against a tax credit. And so all of the contracts throughout the value chain get just inordinate scrutiny, as they should, because that's the revenue item. So I mentioned tax credits a couple times, and then we're going to get into stakeholders and this, but the importance of the tax credits can't be understated, especially when we're going to talk about the House bill. So why are tax credits important to the economics of deals? Unlike anywhere else on Earth right now, the U.S., quote, incentivizes carbon capture projects through the grant or an issuance of a tax credit. For those not close to the tax world, which I would hope many of you are not for your own sanity, tax credit's just a dollar for dollar offset against your income tax. So if you owe $100 of tax and you generate a $10 tax credit, you only owe $90 of tax. So it's true dollar for dollar reduction in what you owe the United States government. Since it's an incentive. Most everywhere else on Earth, and the same could be said for hydrogen, a little less on the geothermal side, but most everywhere else on Earth, projects involving carbon capture are governed or directed through a regulatory regime, right? There's some kind of policy that says, thou shalt reduce emissions in whenever you're making, right? Whether that be a kind of a cap and trade program, which you do have at the state level in places like California, or just pure regulations. But the U.S. took a different approach. 2008, a tax credit, Section 45Q, was put into place to incentivize the capture and qualified use of carbon dioxide. Now, nothing moved for about 10 years, but it's changed again in 18. It was made better in 21 through regulations. It was drastically improved in 2022 through the Inflation Reduction Act. And then this week and next week and then upcoming weeks, we're going to see if that stays the same. But it all comes back to this tax credit. So 45Q is a tax credit for the capture and qualified use of carbon dioxide. And that's what's driving some of these economics. So two things, what is it and who gets it? And then we're going to switch over to the House bill and then get into the economics. So 45Q provides a tax credit for a specific dollar per metric ton of CO or CO2 that's captured and again, had that qualifying use. Both the capture and that use has to happen within the US, so different than some other provisions, right? Right now, I could produce hydrogen, export that anywhere else on Earth through ammonia or methanol, and I could still get my tax credit. For 45Q and carbon capture and the sequestration use has to be in the US, right? Lots of taxy things we could get into, but that's the basics. If you capture a molecule and you do something good with it, you can get a tax credit, okay? Who can claim it? The credit is attributed to the person that owns the capture equipment. So you have to own a piece, not all of the capture equipment. You have to own a piece. So in my example with Peter, so Peter says, hey, Greg, I have this natural gas processing facility. Well, what's carbon capture equipment? Carbon capture equipment is basically everything that separates out saleable molecules from non-saleable molecules. Peter would say, well, hey, the entirety of my facility is carbon capture equipment. Does that mean I have to own Peter's facility? Not at all. I have to own a piece of carbon capture equipment. So maybe it's a compression unit, a dehydration unit. Maybe it's a short pipe that moves things around, although that pipe gets tricky. But I have to own a piece of carbon capture equipment, and I have to be the party that physically or contractually ensures the good use. So if you look at an integrated project, and this is going to drive the discussion we're about to have on core economics, you look at these different pieces of the value chain, the emitter, the capture company, the transport company, downhole provider. And you start by saying, well, who gets this tax credit that we talked about, right? Who gets the tax credit is the person generally who's going to own the capture equipment. So whoever that is that owns the carbon capture equipment, as long as that party's also the one that dictates what happens to that molecule after it's captured and ensures a good use, that person is going to get the tax credit, okay? A couple of key features, and then we'll definitely jump into economics in the House bill. There's minimum annual capture requirements. As of right now, you have to begin construction before January 1st, 2033. We got 7-8 more years to get these projects at least started. Once you put your project in service, it's a 12-year credit, and it's based on what you do. So it's a production credit, right? If we think of tax credits, and again, we'll try not to be too taxy the rest of this, but tax credits are a way that the government can incentivize activity, right? Taxes either deter or encourage actions. You have fuel taxes, you have cigarette taxes, you have incentives for green energy. So whatever the policy driver is at that point in time in Congress and in the White House, that's going to dictate what gets incentivized through the tax code largely, right? Tax credits come in two flavors: an investment tax credit, which is based on what you spend, not what you do, and a production tax credit based on what you do, not what you spend. The key feature here is a 45Q tax credit for carbon capture and sequestration is that it is based on what you do, not what you spend. That's 12 years. Okay. 3 qualified uses we talked about, and then there's a nuance rule around kind of refurbishing old facilities called the 80-20, which we're not going to get into. All right, so what's happening? We talked about this briefly before. There's more than 300 projects, various stages of evolution in the U.S. Future projects are more heavily weighted to permanent sequestration. We just talked about that. 3 things you could do with this. Right? So I capture a molecule off, let's say, off Peter's facility. I can put it downhole for permanent sequestration. I can use it for enhanced oil or natural gas recovery and then sequester it. Or I can get an approved commercial use through the government. Most projects in existence today that are actually dealing with molecules and hydrocarbons are in the enhanced oil or natural gas recovery space. There's market reasons for that, and there's a technical reason for it too. That was the easier path to see how projects would work, and the economics are slightly better on those projects as well. But with a change of investor landscape, with a change of coverage, most all of the projects, not all, but most of the future projects, those 300 in active stages, most of those are in permanent sequestration. So that's where someone's capturing the molecule, either direct air capture or directly from a point source, directly from an industrial or manufacturing facility, moving the molecule and putting it downhole for permanent storage. There's a small sliver, and if we had this discussion a year ago, I would say it's 0% of the market, but we've had a small sliver of development on the utilization piece. So remember I said there's 3 uses: permanent sequestration, enhanced oil and natural gas recovery, or utilization. So that utilization piece, where you take a molecule and you use it in an approved commercial manner, that's the only one you have to pre-clear with the Department of Energy. So to get a credit for that process, let's say I wanted to put it into an aggregate or the backing of a laptop or something, where I'm displacing the molecule, turning it into a product. I have to do a life cycle analysis, submit that to the DOE. DOE has to sign off on it, then Treasury has to sign off on it, and then and only then do I know if I get a credit. And for a very long time, the Department of Energy and the IRS were not approving those, but we are now aware of a handful of those that are getting approved and a handful of those projects that are in the pipeline. But you'd say at a macro level, most of this market is capturing, moving, and permanently sequestering. Okay. Overseas, vastly different story, right? So even though it may feel like our market in the United States isn't moving as fast as people had hoped, there are, comparative to the rest of the globe, there's far more projects at various speeds and at various stages than anywhere else on Earth by a multiple of maybe 10. Right? So there are projects that are advancing in Asia, in the UK, and other areas of Europe. But given the geology and the regulatory environment, they're just not advancing as the same. Tax policy is going to impact these on a go-forward basis, which we're going to talk about here, I think, in the next slide or two. And then the last issue, talk about why aren't things moving? It's a lot of it's permitting, and permitting coming in 2 main areas. The first permit that had gotten folks, I wouldn't say stalled projects, but maybe delayed the start of projects, was that you have to, if you're going to permanently sequester an oxide thousands of feet underground, you have to get generally an EPA Class 6 permit. And the permitting time was anywhere from, we used to say 18 to 24 months, but I think 24 months was on the absolute low end, is 24 months plus. In certain states, so you have your kind of, Wyoming's, North Dakota, Louisiana now, the government has issued primacy. And what that allows the process to do is those states, so Louisiana is the most recent, it can act on behalf of the EPA in granting those Class 6 permits. And the policy behind that was twofold. One, the states probably know their geology and their impacts far better than the federal government does. And then 2, the policy was we want to increase permitting. Now, we have not seen a drastic increase in permitting since Louisiana or Wyoming or North Dakota got primacy, but the goal is to increase or decrease permitting time and increase projects. Okay, that brings us to where Peter opened up, and I thought it was a great opening, saying, hey, are things going to change and how could they change? So if anybody hadn't been following, last week, the House of Representatives issued a draft of one big, beautiful bill. Now, that statement is not my own personal reflection of things. I have clients on all sides of these issues, so I stay out of this. I'm just here to help. The one big, beautiful bill title is the title, right? And that was part of the campaign promise to extend some of the prior Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions maybe provide a little bit of relief from a state and local tax perspective on some deductions, increase or decrease permitting time. There's a bunch of policy goals that are wrapped up in this, but it's a tax-led document. And the reason why I'm bringing it up today is because many of the energy transition, we call it, or green energy decarbonization activities that had been incentivized heavily through the Inflation Reduction Act would be impacted if this bill becomes law. So where this was at is there's a version of this that happened last week, and largely that clawed back most. We'll talk about carbon capture here in 1 second, but most of the tax incentives for green energy and decarbonization efforts. Then they went through a process in the House. There was a manager's version that came out last night, and then the House, after I think a 7-hour, 13-hour stint, passed their version of this bill. Now it's going to head over to the Senate, and we may or may not be able to talk about what happens over there. So what's in this bill right now is not law. It hasn't changed the law, but it does give an indication of what folks are thinking, especially it's made it through the House, and now it's going to be going to the Senate. As expected, though, Section 45Q is I would say one of two credits that are the least impacted in this bill. So if you go back kind of the mini history of this tax credit for carbon capture, so it was put in place in 2008, materially changed from a statute perspective in 2018. Treasury regulations made third-party capital have a clear path to how you turn the stuff into money in 2021. And then it was another material improvement in 2022 in the Inflation Reduction Act. I say those dates to show that this is the only credit that's had bipartisan bicameral support, which means that it's had support from both sides of the aisle in both congressional and presidential settings, right? 2018, I mean, that's what you had Trump changes, right? 2022, you had Biden changes. So in all settings, 45Q, or the carbon capture credit, is the only credit that's been positively impacted. And I think you see that with the draft of the House bill. So 45Q and the 45Z, which impacts these projects as well, or CAN, which is a credit for the clean production of fuel, are the least tinkered with, if you will. Two things that are happening and need more review, and obviously we got to see more language as this goes forward. The proposed language disallows any credit if you have things like specified foreign entities or foreign influence entities involved. So they're tying into certain non-US countries. If those are investors, if those owners of projects, those may have a problem. Those rules are complex, they're detailed. I think they're still being digested, and we're going to see what the final piece of the legislation looks like if and when it gets passed by the House or the Senate. The second piece is around transferability. So one of the things we're going to talk about in just a short minute is how do you turn these things into money? Well, one of the major ways you turn these things into money, these things being projects, and more specifically the credits generated from the project, is by a change from the Inflation Reduction Act, which said we're going to allow somebody to sell their tax credits in the open market for cash and not pay tax on that cash. So my company could sell to Peter's company a tax credit. If Peter's company had to pay tax, he could buy that tax credit from me at a discount, and I don't pay tax on the cash that Peter gives me. In the House version of the bill, and there's a little change in what happened this morning, but the initial House version was maybe not a big fan of the transferability rule, so it limited it in many circumstances. The version that was passed early this morning, and we haven't been able to go through it in detail, does appear to restore transferability or the ability to sell to many credits, and I think you'll have conformity or cleanup changes in the Senate. So right now, no material changes to Section 45Q in this credit. You do have to worry about non-US investors in these projects, which I said that the rules on that will get flushed out over time. And it looks like we probably have a better path to getting the transferability or the ability to have these credits sold in the open market retained. So that gets you, well, how do you turn these things into money to begin with? And then we're going to, I think the last piece we'll talk about is just the different pieces of the value chain. So if I generate a tax credit, again, I said that's the majority of the value in these projects. Not in all cases, but in many cases, is a tax credit. Well, I have four paths that I could take. The first is I could use it on my tax return, going back to that example of hey, I have $100 of taxable income, but I have a $10 tax credit. Well, I'll just use that to offset my $100, and now I only pay $90 of taxes. If that's your fact setting, or if that's your customer setting, or anybody in your value chain setting, they could certainly do that. The problem, however, is these are not cheap projects. And most companies that invest, let's say on the carbon capture side, make a pretty significant capital expenditure, and they're not going to pay tax this year. So I may generate a tax credit this year, but I'm not paying taxes. Why? Because I have a lot of deductions. I have bonus depreciation, which if that goes, that'll exacerbate this issue. But I spend a lot of money, I'm not paying taxes, so I generate this tax credit. If I generate a tax credit when I'm not paying taxes, that's not worth a whole lot to me on a today basis. Sure, I could roll it forward and use it next year or the year after. But as we know, every time you roll forward, becomes less on a net present value basis. So that's not always either an option or a great option. So the second path one could do is you say, well, I heard about this thing in the Inflation Reduction Act about a direct pay. All that means is a refund. So if I generate a credit but don't have taxable income, the government would refund me the difference. Problem with that is that got drastically scaled down in 2022. And so for carbon capture projects, you can only do that, unless you're a tax exempt or government, you can only do that for the first 5 years of your project. Once a 12-year credit, so what do I do for the rest of it? Plus, that gets handled through your tax return, and there's an 18 to 24-month delay between your activity and when you get cash. Same net present value issue. So, well, what do I do about that? Third option, transferability, you sell the credits. Under current rules, if I generate a project, I can sell my tax credit to another company that is paying tax, and they're going to pay me less for that. So I generate $100 million worth of tax credits. There's brokers and there's platforms and there's obviously networks that are involved in there. And I say, well, I could sell that tax credit to, say, an oil company that's paying taxes, and they're going to give me $90 million for my $100 million credit. Why do they like that? Well, they're about to write a $100 million check to the government, and they can satisfy that $100 million obligation by paying 90 to me in exchange for a $100 tax credit. So they drop $10 million to their bottom line. I like it because I've just turned a tax asset that I can't necessarily use today because I'm not paying taxes, and I've turned that into $90 million of tax-free cash, not tax-deferred cash, tax-free cash. That's the rule today, right? The House bill would shorten that window of when you can transfer that, but I think the expectation or hope is that that stays in the final rule. If none of that works, there's a concept called tax equity, and that's basically just I wouldn't say a pure synthetic way, but a joint venture way of getting to the same answer of transferability, maybe even slightly better. So if Peter had money and I was generating a tax credit, and if I couldn't or didn't want to sell my credit to Peter, Peter and I could form a joint venture. I put my project in, he puts his cash in, I end up putting the cash in my pocket, and then we pay Peter back with tax credits and depreciation. As soon as Peter gets all his money back through tax credits and depreciation, then he flips down to a lower percentage and I buy him out. It's a financing mechanism. And that tax equity structure is how wind and solar have been developed and financed over the past 15, 20 years. And there have been a number of carbon capture projects using that structure. Okay, so last piece I want to talk to, and then we'll definitely save time for question, is economic levers. The number one question I get in these, and I've advised on over 71 projects at this point. So I've represented both as a partner at a major law firm and a partner at an accounting firm. I've represented emitters, capture companies, transport companies, space owners, downhole companies, and everything in between. And the number one question you get when you kind of work through these is, well, what's my margin, right? How can I actually make money on this? And then for value chain participants, like let's say you're just in the downhole space, right? You're going to be the pore space. You're going to be the owner of the pore space, and you're going to be the one drilling and monitoring, reporting, and verification, or maybe even make it easier. You're an MRV provider, so all you're going to add to this project is you're going to add the monitoring, the reporting, and the verification. How much can I charge? What's my margin? In earlier projects, and I think this probably started in maybe 2019, 2020-ish. Some of the earlier ones I worked on, I think my first one was about 2014, but a wave started happening where you had, say, entrepreneurial developers going around Texas, Louisiana, some places in the Midwest, and they were leasing up pore space, right? Because for most states, some of it's by statute, some of it's by legal authority, but for most states, the owner of the mineral interest and the owner of the pore space are different parties. So if Peter owns a farm and he owns that in fee simple, so he owns everything from the center of the earth to the heavens, and I go negotiate an oil and gas lease with Peter and says, well, I'd like to drill and develop the working interest, the mineral interest underneath your property. Peter owns the surface estate, topside, and he's going to lease to me the right to extract the minerals, the mineral interest. Well, just because I have the mineral interest does not give me the right to store CO2 downhole. Right? That's a separate right called pore space, and that by most, either again by statute or case law, that's retained by Peter as the owner of the surface estate. So you had all these kind of almost like old wildcatters, right, going across and knocking on doors saying, hey, I'd like to lease up pore space. And what happened on earlier deals, and I've represented a couple folks on the pore space side, they're trying to get the most economics they could possibly get, right? They want lease bonus, just like in oil and gas. They want a $10 per metric ton royalty on stuff that goes downhole. And they were trying to maximize their own economics, which is admirable and certainly is better than not trying to optimize your economics. The issue with that is for many projects, this is a closed system, right? We talked about that earlier project where I said Peter owns the natural gas processing plant. Let's say I do everything. I do capture, so I install my own capture equipment on his facility. I'm going to hire somebody else to move the molecule, a transport company, one of the midstream oil and gas companies. And then I may get an E&P or a downhole provider to do the storage and drilling. Then I'm going to call someone to make sure I get the MRV side of this taken care of, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I don't have a saleable product, so all of those costs, expenses, and everybody's margin throughout the project has to work largely on an $85 per metric ton tax credit, which is not 85, especially if I have to sell it. Maybe it's 10% less than that. So I have to figure out what my total economics are of the entire project. All my costs and every value chain participant's margin has to be able to fit within this. So it's a very delicate balance to make sure these projects work. So if you look at the market, 40% of the market is natural gas processing. The other big components are ammonia related and ethanol related. Why do those work? Well, largely that's the cheapest cost of capture. So anytime we have a situation where it's a lower cost of capture, and then I can pretty much, there's somewhat of a market pricing around transport and storage and MRV at the moment, I can estimate here's what the value of the project is. So whether I'm a service provider just doing one narrow piece, or all I'm doing is the pipe, or all I'm doing is the downhole component of the reporting, I have to make sure that my costs are covered. I make a reasonable margin that I want to do to enter the project, but it can't be so big as to jeopardize the entire project. Otherwise, the project doesn't go. And I raised that pore space example because I had one specific client. We had this discussion, and they said, I hear you, but I want the absolute most I can get. And they were able to negotiate just an unbelievably lucrative space contract. And now what they've seen is projects all around them are getting developed, and nobody will touch their space, because the projects just don't work with a massively expensive space lease. So it is a delicate balance on trying to figure out what are all my economic rights and entitlements, and then what are all my costs. So I listed on this page, and then we'll stop here in a second for question. I listed the value chain participants. That's the emitter, capture company, transport company, the downhole person or utilization person, the landowner or pore space, financing parties, that could be tax equity, or services companies that provide services. And then you have to get into that kind of little rounded rectangle I put in there and do your comparison. What is the cost of everything from the capture to the downhole to the reporting to the compliance to the operation? We have to figure out what those costs are, and then look at the economic rights and entitlements. We spent the majority of this discussion talking about the impact of the tax credits because, frankly, that's the biggest economic driver. 45Q, so that's the one we talked about, that provides up to an $85 credit for permanent sequestration if you're using point source capture. If you go into direct air capture, that goes up to 180, but the economics are vastly, vastly different. It's less, the credit's less than 85 if you're going to do enhanced oil and natural gas recovery. 45Z, for right now, we have 3 years of a clean fuel production. That's involved in these projects largely because of either the biofuels or the ethanol projects. They generate things that could generate a 45Z tax credit, and that's more lucrative than the carbon capture credit. So figuring out what is the source of the emissions, what's the end products people are going to put together, that's going to dictate, well, what credit could you get and in how much? And then I need to look at other things. Carbon offsets, right? Those are non-tax economic rights and entitlements. It says, hey, I've done something that's reduced greenhouse gas emissions, and so I should get this carbon credit. We can get into that if we need to through the Q&A, but in certain projects, those carbon offsets have value, right? If I was doing direct air capture, my forecast and my financial model 100% has to include my carbon offsets. If I'm doing a biofuels project, a bioenergy BECCS project, it's likely that my financial forecast also includes values of carbon offsets. If I'm attaching equipment to a natural gas processing facility, or ammonia and a blue hydrogen facility or anything else, it's likely that I'm really focused on making sure I get entitled to the carbon offset, but I likely do not include that in my financial model due to the lack of liquid market. So I have to figure out exactly what my project is. What are the top line economic rights, which could include things like, hey, product sales, right? Especially if I'm using enhanced oil or natural gas recovery, I'll have saleable hydrocarbons. Or the underlying product, if it becomes low carbon and there's a market for a low carbon product, that could have increased sales. Grants and loans, less of an issue maybe under the current administration, given the policy angles, but something to consider. And then you have to look at things like, well, how do I stack these things? There's state incentives, like a low carbon fuel standard credit out of New Mexico or California. There's these federal incentives like the tax. Can I take both? Can I take a carbon tax credit, carbon offset, and a state level incentive? Maybe, maybe not, right? You have to get into, it all circles back to that point of, in these projects, we have to figure out what is the universe, what's that closed system of economics that has to support the entire program. That's one. Who's entitled to those incentives, right? Tax credits, we said generally are going to be, well, the 45Q credit is generally going to be the person who owns the capture equipment. The 45Z credit is generally the party who's making the fuel, not the capture company, right? So we have to figure out, where do these sit? Carbon offsets can be negotiated to be held anywhere in the value chain. So what's the totality of the economics? Where do these sit? How does that compare to cost? And then how do I view my piece in the value chain? And I think we say that, and we'll stop here, Peter, I think, for questions, but I end in that fashion because that is the most difficult part of this project, is figuring out exactly where you're going to participate, how much you can make money, and can I make money and also have the whole project, be sustained and be profitable on a go-forward basis. So Peter, maybe I'll stop there. It's a lot of me yapping.
Well, thanks. That's actually, you say it's a lot of you yapping, but there was a lot of value there. And I want to thank you for two things in particular. I want to first thank you for making me out to be a rich man, much richer than I am, with all of these gas plants that I own and the space and the like. And I'm sure my wife will be glad to hear that my position in the world has advanced so greatly this morning. Secondly, I want to thank you for reminding me, when you started spouting some of that legal jargon, reminding me why I became a geophysicist instead of becoming a lawyer like my mama wanted me to. That's been entertaining. I have a couple of questions that kind of relate to where you were. First off, you mentioned that there were 300 active projects in the US, really outpacing everywhere else in the world. And I know you mentioned that included the EOR projects, some of which are very old. Do you have any sense of the breakdown? Like, what percentage of those 300 are EOR projects that have been kind of in existence or near planning versus the new Class 6 kind of sequestration projects?
Yeah, I don't offhand. I will say that, I mean, if you look at, I think the last estimate I got on like truly active projects where molecules are going whole, I think out of the 300 of those, I think that's probably around a 10% number. Maybe if you have 30 projects where molecules, because you have a lot in the development stage. Honestly, there's hundreds of projects just waiting on permitting, right? At various stages of permitting. Like some of those could be on the cusp. Of say the 30 or 40 where you have actual, products going whole, how many of those are EOR versus permanent sequestration. If I had to guess, I'd probably say 2/3, 1/3. 2/3 being EOR, 1/3 not being EOR, permanent sequestration. The difficulty here, just from a market perspective, if you wanted to get more stats on this, the EPA used to have a Class 6 tracker. And I don't know if this is good or bad that the EPA does this, but if you looked at right before when Louisiana got primacy, so that was right around last Christmas, right before Louisiana got primacy, and you looked up there, they said, okay, here's the 100 and whatever, I can't remember what the number is, say 190 projects that were moving forward with an EPA Class 6 request. The moment that Louisiana got primacy, that number went down to like 110 or lower. And the reason was that EPA tracker is a federal government tracker. And once a state gets primacy, that comes out of their numbers. So are there Class 6 permits granted? Absolutely. Right? I have clients with molecules downhole in North Dakota and in Wyoming. I mean, people are putting molecules downhole. But to get an accurate count of how many Class 6 permits, you'd have to go look up Wyoming, North Dakota, and Louisiana independently of the EPA granted ones. So it's not dozens and dozens and dozens on the pure sequestration, but it's not one or two either.
Louisiana, the EPA benefited from shifting the blame or the load over to Louisiana. Have Louisiana granted any Class 6 permits yet? I don't think so.
I don't know if they have. I think they were close to one. I mean, timing wise, the other thing to note for anybody who's interested in this space is, last year I was given a presentation at the Louisiana Energy Conference. I think it was last year or the year before, whenever, I guess it's almost 2 years now. But I had one of my lead clients from Exxon who led a bunch of their stuff, and he was going to be presenting in front of the Louisiana board in June or July, and that was going to be the public hearing. So once the state has a public hearing on the primacy, in all three cases, so Wyoming, North Dakota, and now Louisiana, all three have had the same answer, which is the time between the public hearing and the granting of primacy is 6 months. So what we said in that conference a couple of years ago is, hey, this guy's going to be up talking in front. There's going to be a hearing on the primacy issue. And so we would expect that Louisiana grants primacy within 6 months. So that's the timing. So Texas or any other state, if you ever hear about them having a primacy hearing, it's about 6 months after that hearing that it'll be granted.
Okay. So a couple of years ago, I heard that the amount of CO2 being sequestered, and I think this was pure sequestration around the world, was around 40 million tons a year, maybe 42. And I know the goal was to have 1 billion tons or a gigaton or whatever by 2030. We don't seem to be making progress to that. But it actually, the latest numbers I've heard had suggested that the amount being sequestered was down, not up from the 2021 number. Do you have any numbers on that?
I don't. I was actually, as you were asking that, I was flipping over. We have a global point of view, and I was trying to see if I can pull that up. Let me, I'll kind of half look at it while we're going through this. Let me see if I can change.
Well, then let me ask a question that came in over the phone here, if you like. The question was, who owns the CO2 once it is sequestered, and who is liable long term for a leak?
Yeah, great question. And I think part of it can depend on geography, but I'll give you kind of the general view. And I think some of this is going to evolve as you put your deals together. So let's look at it from a value chain perspective. If I'm an emitter, right? So let's say I'm manufacturing something, and I would otherwise be venting my CO2 out into the atmosphere. And somebody comes to me and says, well, why don't I take that CO2 off your hands? Because I'm going to do something with it. First of all, in deals, I've had deals where the emitter actually gets paid. I've had deals where the emitter has to pay. So it really depends on what are the other economic levers. But in either case, that emitter is going to be laser focused on making sure that the title and risk of loss of any molecule that I'm given to the person who takes from me gets away from me. So the emitter is going to say, hey, if you take it, it's yours. You're going to own the title. Same thing on the capture company. So the capture company is going to take, it's going to capture the CO2, dehydrate it, process it, and then at the fence line of the facility, largely it's going to find someone else who's going to take that CO2 and transfer it. CO2 offtake and sequestration agreement. Most all of those agreements, not where they start necessarily, but where they end, involve the title and risk of loss of that CO2 passing from the capture company to the transport company. And to answer the question, most of that transfers down chain. So where you have a combined entity that's doing the transport storage, that company is generally going to take and retain title to the molecule and the risk of loss associated with that. Right? That can be changed a little bit through contract, and then certain states have different rules of saying, hey, well, we're going to have the landowner be on the hook for a certain period of time. After that, we, the state, may take some residual liability. So it does differ by geography, but I will say at a macro level, contractually, everybody's trying to push that ownership and risk of loss as far down the chain as they can.
Right. So it kind of along those lines, the people, and I'm sure by contractually with the liability shifts, I would think the lion's share of the tax credit. But then when it's stuck in the ground and we're doing this MRV, the monitoring, and we find that there is a leak, or can the government claw back on some of these tax credits?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's two ways to that, and that's a great question. And this is, I think you're highlighting a question that really highlights and drives to how, I won't say difficult, but how involved these projects are. So let's say I, Greg, own the capture equipment and I'm going to get a credit. And I hire someone else to move it, and then they hire someone else to put it down the hole. And then you hire someone even else to monitor, report, and verify, right? They're going to be doing the measurements and the testing. I have to make sure that everything downhole works and is perfect, and the indemnity and the loss goes exactly where we need it to. Because if the downhole party, the party involved in the value chain that's going to be responsible for putting that molecule downhole and making it stay downhole, if any of the molecules that I put downhole in the current year leak into the atmosphere, so not just a subsurface leak out of a containment zone, but actually leak out of hit the atmosphere. If it's current year, I don't get a credit for whatever's been leaked. So if I gave you, let's say, Peter, you're the one who's taken the molecule and put it downhole, and I gave you 100,000 metric tons. And you put 100,000 downhole and 10,000 leaked right out in the atmosphere. I only get a credit on 90. Not the full 100,000. I get 90,000 because 10,000 didn't stay downhole, right? It leaked into the atmosphere. Now, contractually, you're going to be paying me for that, right? That's an indemnity you're going to be paying me. So you're going to deal with that. But if I give you 100,000 this year, 100,000 next year, and next year 200,000 came out, you had some catastrophic event that all just came out of the containment, I have to my credit gets completely reversed. So these contracts are set up. So you say, well, who bears the risk of that? Technically, it's the owner of the capture equipment, right? Because that's the one taking the credit on their return. So if there's enough leakage, then the IRS and government can recapture the credit. Practically, these contracts are set up so that if that ever happens, the party that's doing the transport and storage has to make that capture owner whole. So the risk kind of follows the activity. So if you're being paid to sequester the molecule and keep it down whole, if it escapes, then you're going to be paying someone under contract to make them whole.
Wow, this sounds like a real opportunity for a lot of litigation as people chase it down the chain of who really did what to whom. And in that chain, you were mentioning earlier about owning the space and leasing the pore space. So what about space trespass? Somebody thinks they own the space. You mentioned this guy who made a contract that was too expensive. Is he going to be monitoring his fence line to make sure people aren't sneaking gas in there?
Yeah, could. I mean, what's interesting about the evolution of projects, and I know we're close on time here, but the evolution of projects is 6 or 7 years ago, all you had to do is have a lease of pore space and you could raise capital. And then it migrated past 3 or 4 years to say, well, I really need a letter of intent or an MOU with an emitter, and I need my pore space lease. And then you had some issues in the middle of the country around kind of the midstream permitting And now it's a little more, well, I got to have that agreement with the emitter. I need to make sure I'm okay on the permitting side in the middle, and I have to have my pore space. And now what you're seeing with the projects that are moving through is the projects that are moving at scale, at speed, and attracting capital just have excellent operators. So it's excellence downhole, it's excellence on the geology, it's excellence on the MRV, right? This market is kind of, as you would expect, high-graded projects to get into really good operators. Someone says, hey, we need a MicroSeismic involved, or we need others so I can have certainty that this risk is manageable, or that I have the right people to help me work with that risk.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Greg. We have reached the end of our time. I want to thank you very much for taking some of your very valuable time and coming to Houston. I know you're virtual with us. I'm presuming you're in Houston, but I hope you enjoy the rest of your year and your travels amongst the 50 states. I want to thank all the people who have come here today, and I'm sure you've taken away an improvement in your understanding of how the CCUS business is working, the sequestration business, and why it's so difficult to get off I-center. I want to remind you of our talks in the future, and I'm going to shift to our QR code so that you can register. We have several more talks. The next one, Jack Lou on the Harveststone project, the Blue Flint project for Harveststone Capital, and I know you'll enjoy the technical side of how they are advancing that project. Thank you for being here. Hope we can see you in June and through the rest of the year. And for now, I'll say goodbye and thanks again, Greg.